Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of excerpts from Notes of a Publicist by Lenin from 1910. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this piece is being recorded for the Lenin Against Trotsky and General Anti-Trotskyism playlists, which we are currently fleshing out. This piece has some important passages in it, but the entire thing doesn't deal with Trotsky, and it's also kind of just generally on the longer side, which is why we're just doing some excerpts from it. However, if you do have the time, I would suggest reading the whole thing, link in description as usual. Also, this Notes of a Publicist from Lenin is not to be confused with the later one from 1913, which we're actually also going to do as part of this playlist. Now, just to set the stage here, some historical background, 1910 places this document squarely in the middle of the fight against liquidationism. Now, what that was within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which at this point had not yet undergone the split between what we know today as reformist social democracy and revolutionary communism. Both sides were still in the same party at this point, was undergoing a lot of struggle under the conditions of counter-revolution. So in Russia, you had the pre-revolutionary period before 1905, the period of the First Revolution, 1905 to 1907, then a period of counter-revolution, 1908 to 12. And all the while, there was a revisionist or capitalist idea tainted faction within the Marxist party. It showed itself first as so-called economism, then as Menshevism, and then under conditions of counter-revolution, a number of Mensheviks became liquidators, basically hardcore anti-illegalists. They wanted to liquidate or expel any faction of illegal underground struggle, which is super important to revolution, from the party. Lenin fought this intensely and did everything he could to crush liquidationism organizationally, kind of a paradox of tolerance thing. Now, the liquidationists weren't the only faction. There were still some pro-party Mensheviks, however, Lenin regarded them as unreliable. In other words, they claimed to be anti-liquidationist, however, they weren't really going to stand up to them. And then on the other side, there were also some Bolsheviks, a rival faction headed by Bogdanov, which was liquidationist from the left. In other words, they wanted the party only to do illegal things and not to really have above-ground parliamentary or trade union work. And actually, in this piece, Notes of a Publicist, the first section is called the supposed platform of the adherents and defenders of Otzevism. Otzevism means recallists. They wanted to recall or pull back the parliamentary group. Lenin also opposed this, as you can see, in the very first section of this piece. And then there was Trotsky, who had his own faction. Trotsky claimed to be against liquidationism. However, according to Lenin's analysis, everything that he did across years, and despite receiving this criticism, actually really helped the liquidators. Lenin really drills down on this in a 1914 article, which we have on the channel, titled Disruption of Unity Under Cover of Outcries for Unity. And that's from 1914, this piece is from 1910, so you can see that this was a very consistent thing that was going on for years in the party that Lenin was repeatedly critical of. So this piece consists of a very short section 1 that deals with the Otzevists as I described before, and then there's a long section 2, which has a short introduction and then 8 sections. What we're going to read is the introduction to section 2, section 1, which is titled Two Views on Unity, and then the conclusion, the platform of the Bolsheviks, or basically how Lenin was seeking to resolve this. So, this piece was published March 6 and May 25, 1910, in Discussioni Listock, numbers 1 and 2, signed N. Lenin, and published according to that text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 16, HTML transcription and markup by R. Symbala, and you can find it at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this, and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's begin. Section 2. The Unity Crisis in Our Party. On reading this title, some readers perhaps will hardly believe their eyes. Well, that's the limit. What a lot of crises we've had in our own party, and now all of a sudden, a new crisis, a unity crisis. The expression, which sounds so queer, I have borrowed from Liebknecht. He used it in 1875 in a letter dated April 21st to Engels, giving an account of the union of the Lassalleans and the Eisenachers. Marx and Engels thought at that time that no good would come of this union. Liebknecht brushed aside their fears and asserted that the German Social Democratic Party, which had successfully survived all sorts of crises, would also survive the quote-unquote unity crisis. There can be no doubt whatever that our party too, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, will successfully survive its unity crisis. That it is now passing through such a crisis is obvious to everyone who is acquainted with the decisions of the plenary meeting of the Central Committee and with the events that followed. If one were to judge by the resolutions of the plenum, the union might seem to be most complete and fully accomplished. But if one were to judge by what's taking place now, in the beginning of May 1910, if one were to judge by the determined struggle of the Central Organ against Golos Sozialdemokrata, which is published by the liquidators, by the controversy that has flared up between Plekhanov and the other pro-party Mensheviks on the one hand, and the Golosists on the other, or by the extremely abusive attacks of the Viperiod group on the Central Organ. Comment, those are the Otsevists we're talking about in the introduction. Continuing, see the recent leaflet of the group entitled To the Bolshevik Comrades. Then all unity might easily appear to an outsider to be a mere phantom. The avowed enemies of the party are rejoicing. The Viperiodists, the adherents and screeners of Otsevism, are indulging in unbridled abuse. Still more bitter is the abuse leveled by the leaders of the liquidators, Axelrod, Martinov, Martov, Patrusov, and others, in their necessary supplement to Plekhanov's Dnevnik. And the so-called conciliators are at a loss, complaining and uttering helpless phrases. See the resolution passed on April 17, 1910, by the Vienna Social Democratic Party Club, which shares Trotsky's viewpoint. Comment on which Lenin will expand in the next section. Continuing, but the most important and fundamental question as to the reasons why our party union is developing in this and in no other way, why the seemingly complete unity at the plenum is now replaced by seemingly complete disunity, and also the question of what the trend of the further development of the party should be in view of the relationship of forces inside and outside our party. These fundamental questions are not answered either by the liquidators, the Golos group, or by the Otsevists, the Viperiod group, or the conciliators, Trotsky and the so-called Viennese. Abuse and phrasemongering are no answer. Section 2.1. Two Views on Unity. With touching unanimity, the liquidators and the Otsevists are abusing the Bolsheviks uphill and down dale. The liquidators attack Plekhanov as well. The Bolsheviks are to blame. The Bolshevik center is to blame. The, quote, individualistic habits of Lenin and Plekhanov, as quoted from the necessary supplement, are to blame, as well as the, quote, irresponsible group of, quote, former members of the Bolshevik center, see the leaflet of the Viperiod grout. In this respect, the liquidators and the Otsevists are entirely at one. Their block against orthodox Bolshevism, a block which more than once characterized the struggle at the plenum, which I deal with separately below, is an indisputable fact. The representatives of two extreme tendencies, each of them equally expressing subordination to bourgeois ideas, each of them equally anti-party, are entirely at one in their internal party policy, in their struggle against the Bolsheviks, and in proclaiming the Central Organ to be, quote, Bolshevik. But the strongest abuse from Axelrod and Alexinsky only serves to screen their complete failure to understand the meaning and importance of party unity. Trotsky's, the Viennese resolution, only differs outwardly from the effusions of Axelrod and Alexinsky. It is drafted very cautiously and lays claim to above-faction fairness. But what is its meaning? The, quote, Bolshevik leaders are to blame for everything. This is the same supposed philosophy of history as that of Axelrod and Alexinsky. The very first paragraph of the Vienna Resolution states, quote, the representatives of all factions and trends, by their decision at the plenum, consciously and deliberately assumed responsibility for carrying out the adopted resolutions in the present conditions in cooperation with the given persons, groups, and institutions, unquote. This refers to, quote, conflicts in the Central Organ. Who is, quote, responsible for carrying out the resolutions, unquote, of the plenum in the Central Organ? Obviously, the majority of the Central Organ, i.e. the Bolsheviks and the Poles. It is they who are responsible for carrying out the resolutions of the plenum, quote, in cooperation with the given persons, unquote, i.e. with the Golosists and Viperiodists. Comment, again, that's the liquidationists and the Otsevists, respectively. Continuing, what does the principal resolution of the plenum say in that part of it which deals with the most, quote, vexed problems of our party, with questions which were most disputable before the plenum and which should have become least disputable after the plenum? It says that bourgeois influence over the proletariat manifests itself, on the one hand, in rejecting the illegal Social Democratic Party and belittling its role and importance, etc., comment, in other words, liquidationism, continuing, and on the other hand, in rejecting social democratic work in the Duma, parliament, as well as the utilization of legal possibilities, comment, in other words, Otzevism, continuing, the failure to grasp the importance of both one and the other, etc. Now, what is the meaning of this resolution? Does it mean that the Bolsheviks should have sincerely and irrevocably put an end to rejecting the illegal party and belittling it, etc., that they should have admitted this to be a deviation, that they should have gotten rid of it and done positive work in a spirit hostile to this deviation, that the Viperiatists should have sincerely and irrevocably put an end to rejecting Duma work and legal possibilities, etc., that the majority of the central organ should in every way have enlisted the cooperation of the Bolsheviks and Viperiatists on condition that they sincerely, consistently, and irrevocably renounce the deviations described in detail in the resolution of the plenum? Or does the resolution mean that the majority of the central organ is responsible for carrying out the resolutions on the overcoming of liquidationist and Otzevist deviations, quote, in cooperation with the given Bolsheviks, who continue as before, and even more crudely to defend liquidationism, and with the given Viperiatists, who continue as before, and even more crudely to assert the legitimacy of Otzevism, ultimatumism, etc.? This question needs only to be put for one to see how hollow are the eloquent phrases in Trotsky's resolution, to see how in reality they serve to defend the very position held by Axelrod and Company, and Alexinsky and Company. In the very first words of his resolution, Trotsky expressed the full spirit of the worst kind of conciliation. Conciliation here in inverted commas, of a sectarian and Philistine conciliation, which deals with the given persons and not the given line of policy, the given spirit, the given ideological and political content of party work. It is in this that the enormous difference lies between real partyism, which consists in purging the party of liquidationism and Otzevism, and the conciliation of Trotsky and Company, which actually renders the most faithful service to the liquidators and Otzevists, and is therefore an evil that is all the more dangerous to the party, the more cunningly, artfully, and rhetorically it cloaks itself with professedly pro-party, professedly anti-factional declamations. In point of fact, what is it that we've been given as the task of the party? Is it given persons, groups, and institutions that we have been given and that have to be reconciled irrespective of their policy, irrespective of the content of their work, irrespective of their attitude toward liquidationism and Otzevism? Or have we been given a party line, an ideological and political direction and content of our entire work? The task of purging this work of liquidationism and Otzevism, a task that must be carried out irrespective of persons, groups, and institutions, in spite of the opposition of persons, groups, and institutions which disagree with that policy or do not carry it out. Two views are possible on the meaning of and conditions for the achievement of any kind of party unity. It is extremely important to grasp the difference between these views, for they become entangled and confused in the course of development of our unity crisis, and it is impossible to orientate ourselves in this crisis unless we draw a sharp line between them. One view on unity may place in the forefront the so-called reconciliation of given persons, groups, and institutions. The identity of their views on party work, on the policy of that work, is a secondary matter. One should try to keep silent about differences of opinion and not elucidate their causes, their significance, their objective conditions. The chief thing is to supposedly reconcile persons and groups. If they do not agree on carrying out a common policy, that policy must be interpreted in such a way as to be acceptable to all. Live and let live. This is Philistine's pseudo-conciliation, which inevitably leads to sectarian diplomacy. To plug up the sources of disagreement, to keep silent about them, to adjust conflicts at all costs, to neutralize the conflicting trends, it is to this that the main attention of such pseudo-conciliation is directed. In circumstances in which the illegal party requires a base of operations abroad, this sectarian diplomacy opens the door to persons, groups, and institutions that play the part of honest brokers in all kinds of attempts at pseudo-conciliation and neutralization. Here is what Martov, in Golos number 19-20, relates of one such attempt at the plenum. Quote, "The Mensheviks, Pravdists, and Bundists proposed a composition of the central organ which would ensure quote-unquote neutralization of the two opposite trends in the party ideology, and would not give a definite majority to either of them, thus compelling the party organ to work out, in relation to each essential question, that mean or average course which could unite the majority of party workers." Unquote. As is known, the proposal of the Mensheviks was not adopted. Trotsky, who put himself forward as candidate for the central organ in the capacity of neutralizer, was defeated. The candidature of a Bundist for the same post, the Mensheviks in their speeches proposed such a candidate, was not even put to the vote. Such is the actual role of those conciliators, in the bad sense of the word, who wrote the Vienna Resolution and whose views are expressed in Yanov's article in number 4 of Odkliki Bunda, which I have just received. The Mensheviks did not venture to propose a central organ with a majority of their own trend, although, as is seen from Martov's argument above quoted, they recognized the existence of two opposite trends in the party. The Mensheviks did not even think of proposing a central organ with a majority of their trend. They did not even attempt to insist on a central organ with any definite trend at all. So obvious at the plenary session was the absence of any trend among the Mensheviks, who were only required, only expected, to make a sincere and consistent renunciation of liquidationism. The Mensheviks tried to secure so-called neutralization of the central organ, and they proposed as neutralizers either a Bundist or Trotsky. The Bundist or Trotsky was to play the part of a matchmaker who would undertake to unite in wedlock, so to speak, given persons, groups, and institutions, irrespective of whether one of the sides had renounced liquidationism or not. This standpoint of a matchmaker constitutes the entire so-called ideological basis of Trotsky's and Yanov's conciliation. When they complain and weep over the failure to achieve unity, it must be taken with a grain of salt. It must be taken to mean that the matchmaking failed. The, quote, failure of the hopes of unity cherished by Trotsky and Yanov, hopes of unity with given persons, groups, and institutions, irrespective of their attitude to liquidationism, signifies only the failure of the matchmakers, the falsity, the hopelessness, the wretchedness of the matchmaking point of view, but it does not at all signify the failure of party unity. There is another view on this unity, namely that long ago, a number of profound objective causes, independently of the particular composition of the given persons, groups, and institutions, submitted to the plenum and at the plenum, began to bring about, and are steadily continuing to bring about, in the two old and principal Russian factions of social democracy, changes that create, sometimes undesired and even unperceived by some of the given persons, groups, and institutions, ideological and organizational bases for unity. These objective conditions are rooted in the specific features of the present period of bourgeois development in Russia, the period of bourgeois counter-revolution, and attempts by the autocracy to remodel itself on the pattern of a bourgeois monarchy. These objective conditions simultaneously give rise to the inseparably interconnected changes in the character of the working class movement, in the composition, type, and features of the social democratic vanguard, as well as changes in the ideological and political tasks of the social democratic movement. Hence the bourgeois influence over the proletariat that gives rise to liquidationism, which is equal to semi-liberalism, which likes to consider itself part of social democracy, and Otzevism, which is equivalent to semi-anarchism, which also likes to consider itself part of social democracy, is not an accident nor evil design, stupidity, or error on the part of some individual, but the inevitable result of the action of these objective causes and the superstructure of the entire labor movement in present-day Russia, which is inseparable from the basis. The realization of the danger, of the non-social democratic nature and harmfulness to the labor movement of both these deviations brings about a rapprochement between the elements of various factions and paves the way to party unity, quote, despite all obstacles. From this point of view, the unification of the party may proceed slowly, with difficulties, vacillations, waverings, and relapses, but proceed it must. From this point of view, the process of unification does not necessarily take place among given persons, groups, and institutions, but irrespective of given persons, subordinating them, rejecting those of them who do not understand or who do not want to understand the requirements of objective development, promoting and enlisting new persons not belonging to those given, so to speak, effecting changes, reshufflings, and regroupings within the old factions, trends, and divisions. From this point of view, unity is inseparable from its ideological foundation. It can grow only on the basis of an ideological rapprochement. It is connected with the appearance, development, and growth of such deviations as liquidationism and Otzevism, not by the accidental connection between particular polemical statements of this or that literary controversy, but by an internal, indissoluble link, such as that which binds cause and effect. Section 2.8. Conclusion. The platform of the Bolsheviks. The party conference fixed by the plenum cannot and must not confine itself to the agenda proposed by the plenum on condition that all the Mensheviks come over to the party position. This did not happen, and it is not fitting for us to play hide-and-seek with ourselves. The election slogan for this conference, the slogan under which it is to be convened and prepared, must be the rallying of the party members in the struggle against the group of independent legalists. In accordance with this task and taking into account the anti-party position of the Bolsheviks, we must resolutely reorganize all the leading institutions of the party, so that they shall be concerned not with the squabbles which every Bolshevik is preparing and will henceforth be preparing for them, but with the real work of building the party. The Bolsheviks do not want to build the party, they want to help secretly the group of independent legalists. The following must be the platform of the Bolsheviks for this conference: to build the party in accordance with the December 1908 resolutions and in their spirit, to continue the work of the plenum, making the above-mentioned corrections of its decisions, corrections which have been dictated by the entire course of events since the plenum, to concentrate all our efforts on a systematic, undeviating, comprehensive, and persistent utilization of each and every legal possibility in order to gather the forces of the proletariat, to help it to group and consolidate itself, to help it to train itself for the struggle and stretch its limbs, and also steadily to restore the illegal party units, to learn how to adapt them to new conditions, to restore the illegal, purely party organizations, and first and foremost, the purely proletarian organizations, which alone are capable of directing all the work in the legal organizations, to imbue this work with the revolutionary social democratic spirit, to carry on an irreconcilable struggle against the renegades and the independent legalists, and to prepare for the time when our party, the RSDLP, having preserved all the traditions of the revolution and of the great victories of the proletariat in 1905, and having strengthened and enlarged the proletarian army of the party, will lead it into a new battle, to new victories. Alright, and that's the end of the audiobook. So, as with most of these, there is criticism of the role that Trotsky was playing, and we should learn from that, but there's also more general lessons that extend beyond anti-Trotskyism. In this case, for struggling against reformism and the most extreme form, where the reformists are trying to eliminate any kind of illegal underground revolutionary organization, which, if the conditions of legality change and suddenly so much legal activity is not allowed, then that would leave the overall organization without that underground wing to fall back on, basically leaving it with nothing and having to start all over again. For those working in a Big Ten organization, even one which, according to its sort of original premise, is leaning more heavily toward reformism, such as DSA, there are lessons here that you can take into that struggle as well. Anyway, that's it for me. Thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. So if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.